Chapter 3. The Sentimental Gentleman. The voice that spoke to me from bedroom led me onto my new home in Savannah, the second floor of a carriage house on East Charlton Lane. I had two small rooms that looked out on a garden and the rear of a townhouse. The garden had a fragrant magnolia and a small banana tree. The apartment's furnishings included an old navigator's globe on a stand. On my first night in the residence, I put my finger on Savannah and, turning the globe, followed the 30-second parallel around the world. Marrakesh, Tel Aviv, and Nanking passed beneath my finger. Savannah stood on the westernmost point of the east coast, due south of Cleveland. It was south of New York by 9 degrees of latitude, which should have been enough to make a difference in the angle of the moon in the sky, I figured. The crescent would be turned clockwise slightly tonight, so that it would look more like the letter U than the letter C, as it had been the night before in New York. Or would it be the other way around? I looked out the window to see, but the moon had slipped behind a cloud. It was at about that time that as I was attempting to fix my exact location in the universe, that I became aware of laughing voices and the sound of a honky-tonk piano coming over the garden wall. The song was Sweet Georgia Brown, and it was sung by a smooth baritone voice. The next song was How Come You Do Me Like You Do. A party was in progress a few houses away, and I took this to be a good sign. The music made an agreeable background sound, if a little corny, and the piano player was very good. Tireless too. The last song I remember that night before falling asleep was Lazy Bones. It was written, appropriately enough, by Johnny Mercer. A few hours later, shortly after dawn, the music started in again. Piano Roll Blues was the first tune of the morning, as I recall. Then came Darktown Strutter's Ball. The music continued in that vein, off and on, throughout the day and late into the evening. It did the same the following day, and the day after that. The piano was a permanent part of the atmosphere, apparently, and so was the party, if a party is what it was. I traced the music to 16 East Jones Street, a yellow stucco townhouse, 4 houses away. In most respects, the house was like all others on the block, except for a steady stream of visitors who came and went at all hours of the day and night. There was no common denominator among them. They were young and old, alone and in groups, white and black. But I did notice that none of them rang the doorbell or knocked. They just pushed the door and went in. Unlocked doors were highly unusual, even in Savannah. I assumed that eventually all this would explain itself, and in the meantime I set about becoming acquainted with my new surroundings. The garden part of the city, with its geometrical arrangement of squares, encompassed the 3 square mile historic district, which was built before the Civil War. City fathers abandoned the squares later on, when the city expanded southward. Immediately south of the historic district laid a wide swath of Victorian gingerbread houses. These gave way to Ardsley Park, an enclave of early 20th century houses with proud facades that featured columns, pediments, porticos and terraces. South of Ardsley Park, the scale of the houses diminished. There were bungalows built in the 30s and 40s, then ranch houses of the 50s and 60s, and finally the south side, a flat, semi-rural terrain that could have been anywhere in America except for occasional echoes of Dixie, such as the 12 Oaks. And finally the south side, a flat, semi-rural terrain that could have been anywhere in America except for occasional echoes of Dixie, such as the 12 Oaks Shopping Plaza and the Tara Cinemas. At the Georgia Historical Society, an obliging librarian clarified a few matters for me. No, she said, there had never been any such woman as hard-hearted Hannah. The librarian suspected that Hannah had simply been the product of a songwriter needing a rhyme. She added with a sigh that sometimes she wished that Hannah had been the vamp of Montana instead. Savannah could lay claim to enough real history, she said, that it had no need for false honours. Did I know, for example, that Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin at Mulberry Plantation in Savannah, or that Juliette Gordon Low had founded the Girl Scouts of America in a carriage house on Drayton Street? The librarian recited a list of Savannah's historic highlights. America's first Sunday school had been founded in Savannah in 1736, America's first orphanage in 1740, America's first black Baptist congregation in 1788, America's first golf course in 1796. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, had been the minister of Christ Church in Savannah in 1736, and during his tenure had written a book of hymns that had become the first hymnal used in the Church of England. A Savannah merchant had bankrolled the first steamship ever to cross the Atlantic, the Savannah, which made its maiden voyage from Savannah to Liverpool in 1819. The cumulative weight of all of these historic firsts suggested this sleepy city of 150,000 had once been more important in the general scheme of things than it was now. Sponsoring the world's first ocean-going steamship in 1819, for example, would have been the equivalent of launching the first spaceships today. President James Monroe had made a special trip to Savannah in honour of the maiden voyage, a fair indication of its importance. I browsed among the books, prints and maps in the Society's reading room, a spacious hall with a high ceiling and double tier of bookshelves along the wall. The Civil War loomed large in this room, and Savannah's role in it was a story that seemed to say a great deal about the city. At the outbreak of fighting, Savannah was the world's leading cotton port. General William Tecumseh Sherman selected it as the climax for his triumphant march to the sea, bringing 70,000 troops against Savannah's 10,000. Unlike their counterparts in Atlanta and Charlestown, Savannah's civic leaders were practical businessmen, and their secessionist passions were tempered by a sobering awareness of the destination that was about to befall them. Unlike their counterparts in Atlanta and Charlestown, Savannah's civic leaders were practical businessmen, and their secessionist passions were tempered by a sobering awareness of the devastation that was about to befall them. When Sherman drew near, the mayor of Savannah led a delegation out to meet him. They offered to surrender the city without a shot if Sherman promised not to burn it. Sherman accepted the offer and sent President Lincoln a famous telegram. "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton." Sherman stayed a month and then marched to Columbia, South Carolina, and burned it to the ground. Savannah emerged from the war impoverished, but it recovered within a few years and prospered once again. By then, however, the city's financial underpinnings had begun to erode. Rural labour was being drawn away to the industrialised north. Years of growing nothing but cotton had leached the soil of nutrients, and the centre of the cotton belt moved westward. In the financial panic of 1892, the price of a pound of cotton dropped from $1 to 9 cents. By 1920, the boll weevil had wiped out what little cotton activity was left. From that time onward, Savannah slipped into decline. Many of its once great houses fell into disrepair. Lady Astor, passing through in 1946, remarked that Savannah was like a beautiful woman with a dirty face. Stung by criticism, a group of concerned citizens began in the 1950s to restore Savannah's downtown. Their effort resulted in the preservation of Savannah's historic district. Before leaving the reading room, I thought to look up the 1914 city directory for the name of Sadie Jefferson, the woman who had tangoed all the way to the police station. She was not listed. No Jeffersons were listed at all, in fact. The librarian looked at my old newspaper clipping and told me I had probably consulted the wrong part of the city directory. "You can tell from the wording of the news item that Sadie Jefferson was black," she said, "because of the courtesy title of Miss or Mrs. is omitted. That was the practice until integration. That was the practice until integration. It was also the practice to list blacks in a separate section of our city directory. That's probably why you couldn't find her. Indeed, Sadie Jefferson was listed in the coloured section of the 1914 city directory, the wife of James E. Jefferson, a barber. She had died in the 1970s. The story of blacks in Savannah was, of course, a very different one to that of whites. Slavery was forbidden in Georgia in 1735. Oglethorpe called it a horrible crime. But in 1749, the colony's trustees gave in to pressure from the settlers and legalised it. Despite a long history of oppression, the 1960s civil rights movement in Savannah was almost entirely non-violent. Civil rights leaders staged sit-ins at lunch counters, swim-ins at the beach, kneel-ins at churches, and a 15-month boycott of segregated stores. Tensions rose, but peace prevailed, largely because of the tireless efforts of a forward-thinking mayor, Malcolm McLean, and a non-violent strategy adopted by black leaders, notably W. Law, the head of the local branch of the NAACP. In 1964, Martin Luther King declared Savannah the most desegregated city in the South. In 1980, the population of Savannah was half white and half black. There was ample evidence in the records of the Historical Society that in Savannah's palmier days it had been a cosmopolitan city, and its citizens an unusually worldly sort. Mayor Richard Arnold, the man who had sweet-talked General Sherman in and out of town during the Civil War, was typical of the breed. He was a physician, a scholar, an epicure, a connoisseur of fine wines, and a gentleman who took his social obligations seriously. He wrote in one letter, Yesterday I entertained the Honourable Howell Cobb at a social dinner party. We sat down at 3 o'clock and got up at 9:30. Mayor Arnold's 6.5-hour dinner lent weight to what I had been told about Savannah's fondness for parties, and put me in mind of the genteel merriment going on non-stop in the townhouse down the street from me at 16 East Jones Street. My casual surveillance of the house paid off one day at noontime. A car drew up to the curb and screeched to a jolting stop. At the wheel was a neatly dressed elderly lady with white hair as neat as pie crust. She had made no attempt to parallel park, but had instead pulled into the space front end as if tethering a horse to a pitching post. She got out and marched to the front door, took out a ball-peen hammer from her purse, and methodically smashed all the little panes of glass around the door. Then she put the hammer back in her purse and walked back to her car. The incident did not seem to make any difference to the people in the house. The piano went right on playing, and the voices kept on laughing. The panes of glass were replaced, but not until several days later. As I expected, it all became perfectly clear soon enough. One night after dinner, I heard the click of spike heels coming up the steps, followed by a gentle knock on the door. I opened it to behold a beautiful woman standing in the moonlight. Her head was tucked into a platinum cloud of cotton candy hair. She wore a low-cut pink dress, which she filled voluptuously, and was giggling. "Wouldn't you know," she said, "they've gone and turned off Joe's electricity again." "They have," I answered. "Who's Joe?" She was momentarily confused. "You don't know Joe? I thought everybody knew Joe. He's your neighbour. I mean, he's almost your neighbour. Joe Odom." She waved in a westerly direction. "He lives a couple of houses down that way. Not the house with the piano." This comment sent the woman into gales of pretty laughter. "Uh-huh, you got it." "And is Joe Odom the one that plays the piano?" "He sure is," she said. "And I'm Mandy Nichols. I don't mean to disturb you or nothing, but I saw your light on. Anyway, we run out of ice, and I was sort of hoping you could spare some." I invited her in. As she brushed by me, I breathed in the essence of gardenia. I recognized her now as one of the many people I had seen going into the house down the street. There was no way I possibly could have forgotten her. She was a statuesque beauty, with not a single angular contour on her soft and lovely body. Her blue eyes were set off by a bright framework of lavishly applied cosmetics. I took 4 ice trays out of the freezer and emptied them into an ice bucket. I told her I had been wondering who lived in that house. "Officially, it's just Joe," she said. "But sometimes it's hard to tell, with so many people spending the night, or the week, or a few months. I live in Waycross, and I drive into Savannah 6 days a week to sing at the clubs here in town. If I'm too tired to drive home at night, I just stay at Joe's." Mandy said she had gone to the University of Tennessee on half scholarship for twirling. She also said she had been crowned Miss BBW in a Las Vegas event a year beforehand. "What's BBW?" "That stands for Big Beautiful Woman," she said. "It's a beauty contest for large women. They put out a magazine and a line of clothing, the whole 9 yards. I really didn't plan on entering the pageant, though. My friend sent in the application." I gave her the ice bucket. "Hey," she said, "why don't you come over and join us for a drink?" I had been about to suggest that very thing myself, so I accepted without hesitation and followed her down the stairs and into the lane. Mandy walked gingerly. The pebbles clicked and clacked and skittered under her spiked heels. "It's a long drive from Waycross to Savannah, isn't it?" "About an hour and a half," she said, "each way." "Does that get a little boring, day after day?" "Not really. Gives me a chance to do my nails." "Your nails?" "Of course," she giggled. "Why not?" "I don't know. It just sounds a little complicated," I said, "doing your nails and driving at the same time." "It's real easy once you get the hang of it," she said. "I drive with my knees." "Your knees?" "Uh-huh. I actually save my nails for last. I do my makeup first and then my hair." I looked at the brilliant palette of colours on Mandy's smiling face. This was no simple application of lipstick and mascara. This was a complex composition that involved the blending of many hues and tints. There were pinks and blues and umber, topped by the platinum blonde nimbus of her hair. "I backcomb my hair," she said. "You must attract a lot of attention on the road," I said, doing all that. "Yeah, sometimes," she said. "Yesterday I pulled into a gas station and this truck driver followed right in behind me and pulled up alongside. He said, 'Man, I have been driving behind you the last 45 minutes and I've been watching you. First you did your makeup, then your hair, then you did your nails. I just want to get up close and see what you look like.' He gave me a big wink and told me I was right pretty. But then he said, 'Let me ask you something. I noticed every couple of minutes you've been reaching over and fooling with something in the seat next to you. What you got over there?' 'That's my TV,' I told him. 'I can't miss my soaps.' We walked from the lane into Joe Odom's garden. Candlelight flickered in the windows of the darkened house. Two men crouched by the garden wall. One held a flashlight while the other knelt in front of the electric meter. The kneeling man wore big rubber gloves, which he gripped with a large... The kneeling man wore big rubber gloves, with which he gripped a large pair of pliers. He appeared to be splicing two cables together. "Careful, Joe," the man with the flashlight said. A shower of sparks jumped from the cable, and the lights in the house next door dimmed for a moment. As they came back up to full strength, the lights in Joe's house blinked on. Cheers went up from inside. Joe stood up. "Well, I guess I didn't get electrocuted this time," he said. "Maybe next time." He bowed silently to the neighbouring house. Joe Odom had a moustache and greying blonde hair. He wore a light blue shirt open at the neck, chinos, and He wore a light blue shirt open at the neck, chinos, and brown and white saddle shoes. He was about 35 and looked remarkably calm. I thought, for someone who had just pulled off a life-threatening, high-voltage act of larceny. "I've got ice," said Mandy. "And an ice man too, I see." Joe flashed a bright smile. "I don't usually putter around in the garden this late at night," he said. "But, well, we had a few problems out here that needed tending to." He took off the rubber gloves. "I reckon I'm getting pretty good at this. I can turn the water and gas back on too. Remember that. Someday you may need my services. I'm only fair at telephones though. I can reconnect a phone that's been cut off, but I can't make it do anything except receive incoming calls, no outgoing." Somewhere under the steps, an air conditioning condenser clicked on. "Lovely sound, innit?" said Joe. "Why don't we all go inside and drink a toast to it? And to the lights, and the dishwasher, and the microwave, and the refrigerator, and the Savannah Electric and Power Company, and to..." He raised an imaginary glass in the direction of the house next door. "Whoever." Joe Odom's townhouse was furnished in a manner I would not have expected for the home of a utilities deadbeat. On the parlour floor, I saw a fine English sideboard, several good 18th century oil portraits, a pair of antique silver sconces, a Steinway grand piano, and 2 or 3 impressive oriental carpets. There were people in every room, it seemed. Not quite a party, more an open house. "I'm a tax lawyer," said Joe, "and a real estate broker, and a piano player. I used to be a partner in a law firm, but a couple of years ago I quit and moved my office into this house so I could mix business and pleasure in whatever proportion I wanted. That's when my third wife left me." Joe nodded towards a young man asleep on the couch in the living room. "That's Clint. If you ever need a ride to Atlanta, Clint would be happy to help you. He drives trailer trucks back and forth and likes to have company in the cab. I should warn you, though, he makes the trip in just under 3 hours. Nobody who's ever been on one of those wild rides has ever gone back for a second one." A girl with a red ponytail was talking on the telephone in the kitchen. Joe told me she was a disc jockey for one of Savannah's top 40 radio stations. He added that a man she was dating had been arrested for dealing cocaine and for making terroristic threats against the police. In the dining room, a blond man dressed in a white shirt and white slacks was cutting a woman's hair. "That's Jerry Spence," said Joe. "He cuts all our hair. And right now he's doing Anne, my first and second wife. Anne and I were childhood sweethearts. We got married for the first time when I was in law school, and the second time on the anniversary of our first divorce. And of course, you've met Mandy here. She's my 4th wife in waiting." "What's she waiting for?" I asked. for her divorce to come through, said Joe. There's no telling when that'll happen, because her attorney is a lazy cuss who hasn't gotten around to filling the paperwork yet. I guess we can't complain about it though, because I'm her attorney. The social centre of the house was the kitchen, which overlooked the garden. It had a piano in it, and it was from this room that the music and laughter spilled out over the garden walls up and down the street. I noticed you leave your front door unlocked, I said. That's right. It got to be too much trouble going down to answer it all the time. That was one of my third wife's grievances. Odom laughed. Well, the front door seems to be one of my grievances too, says Mandy. Especially since the burglary last week. Joe says it wasn't a burglary, but I say it was. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were both in bed. I woke up and I heard noises downstairs, and I shook Joe. Joe, we got burglars, I said. But he didn't care. Oh, it could be anybody, he said. But I was sure it was burglars. They were opening cupboards and drawers and I don't know what all. So I shook him again and I said, Joe, go down and see. Well, Mr. Cool just lifted his head a few inches off the pillow and hollered, Angus, that you, Angus? There was total silence, of course, so Joe says to me, well, if we got a burglar, his name ain't Angus. Then he went back to sleep. But it was a burglar, and we were lucky we weren't murdered.